This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's first on-demand workshop, How to Become a Coffee Consultant. Available now online for you to learn at your own pace with a certificate available upon completion. Click the link in the show notes to access today for just €50. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is the beginning of our next 5-part series. Today, we are starting a conversation about acquiring coffee knowledge. And this is going to be an interesting conversation. We have Simon Gautherin with us, an Australian coffee professional. Welcome to the conversation, Simon.
Thanks, Lee.
We are today going to be revisiting the way that you and I acquired knowledge and the trends that we saw over our career in the industry, and the way we've witnessed coffee knowledge emerge through the industry. And you being someone who competes and you're using your platform in competition to kind of put forward some of the coffee knowledge that you've acquired. We kind of had a conversation about the idea of coffee knowledge and thought it would be an interesting one to bring to the podcast, which is separate from coffee education. We want to make that distinction up front. So, Simon, as we get started, why don't you give everyone an introduction into what you do and who you are and how we got here?
Sure. So I'm Simon Gautherin. I was born and raised in Paris in France, and I moved to Australia in 2016 to do my studies. I have 2 masters in business and management, nothing to do with coffee. I started initially in strategy consulting and eventually moved to coffee. And I've been in coffee, I sort of got into coffee in 2014, more as a hobby and as a student, sort of like a student's job. And it became a passion. And I ended up dropping strategy consulting to move fully into coffee. And from day one, I realized that knowledge in coffee was an issue. Mm-hmm. And because it was something that wasn't structured, I was used to this sort of like academic world where you have access to a lot of structured information. You're going to classrooms and conferences, and it's widely available, and it's also coherent from different sources. But when I started learning about coffee, it was complete chaos. So that was my introduction to the coffee world, trying to learn about coffee, but finding very contradictory sources, finding things that were incredibly difficult to understand, not very easily explained in easy terms. So that was my introduction to coffee. And now, so from day one, I decided that I wanted to work in coffee, and more specifically coffee education, and to help tackle this knowledge issue that we have in the industry, and to make it easier for other people to get into the industry. Because I thought it was quite chaotic for me. I'm sure it was chaotic for thousands of people. I'm sure it was the same thing for you. Just having access to knowledge was difficult. So I've made it a personal mission to help tackle this issue in the future.
Beautiful. In preparation for this conversation, I was like, because when you and I decided we wanted to do this, we started the conversation at, we want to talk about education. And then as we dissected what that was about, we decided it was more about knowledge. And I've been thinking a lot about, well, what's the difference between knowledge and education? And I feel like education is the transfer of knowledge.
Yes.
And what we're here to talk about is where the coffee industry decides when something's right and who decides when something's right. So in today's conversation, in the first of the 5-part series, we're going to look at what defines an expert in the coffee industry. Because in the 20 years that I've been in the industry, for that whole time, a lot of people have thought that they were experts, and there's no real definition of what an expert really is in the coffee industry, because a lot of it seems to be, a lot of it seems to be based on something that is subjective. And we're going to talk about that in a future episode. But how do you define an expert, Simon?
So, I mean, if you look at the definition of an expert, it's someone that has a great deal of knowledge and has a specific skill set, and that has basically is showing some experience, showing some qualifications and credentials in a specific field, and has some previous accomplishments. So when you look at being an expert for example, mathematics. It's be looking at someone that has done studies, that has done research, that has written white papers on a specific field, etc. Now, for coffee specifically, what makes an expert is some elements of these three things combined. So someone has worked in the industry for a long time, someone that has potentially some accreditation and credentials like SCA training, CQI, Q grading, etc., and someone who's an accomplished professional. So someone who's competed, for example, someone who's run a successful business, someone who's done publications, who's done research. All these things combined create an expert. But you did point out something interesting, which is some people think that they're experts and they're maybe not real experts, etc. And the issue with that is, I don't think people necessarily do that intentionally. Sorry, I think it's mainly about the fact that knowledge changes. What is true today might not be true tomorrow, and I think that's something that I want to talk about in this podcast.
Yeah, you have a really interesting idea that I've been thinking about since you mentioned it to me: the relationship between knowledge and space-time.
Yeah.
And those things are really relative in the way that they move forward. So this idea that something can be true, for example, at the beginning of my career, ristrettos were the way that we drank coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, anyone was saying the only way to drink coffee was as a ristretto, and that was it. And then the next part of it was the double ristretto's gone. It's the single ristretto, and it's a half of a single ristretto. So we were drinking coffee that was sour as anything. And when I would say to people, intense. I don't like this, it's really sour, it's terrible, they would say, you don't know what you're talking about. I know what I'm talking about. And I'm like, well, sure, you've been in the industry for longer than I have, and I'm a puppy barista, but this doesn't taste good to me. Is this what I'm supposed to decide is good? And so that knowledge transference was, I was vulnerable because I was new into the industry and there was no rules 20 years ago of what we were aiming for. So at that particular time, that was true. In that space and time, that information was true. Now you fast forward 20 years and it's a whole different story. And I really love this concept of yours.
And it might actually still be true for ristrettos in specific places in the world, in specific circles, social circles, etc. So which is why I think it's something that I've learned a long time ago, just about knowledge and truth in general. Like, truth is relative to time and space. When you look at it 1,000 years ago, everyone believed that the earth was flat. And some people even get killed over
now. Some people do believe it now.
Some people still believe that now. So truth is relative to time and space, and it's something that's constantly evolving. And so there are things that were true 20 years ago when you learned how to make coffee, and there were definitely some general consensus on specific topics, which doesn't mean that these people were necessarily wrong, but the truth back then is not the truth that we have today, because we have different evidence of the contrary of that truth, and also because you mentioned trends, and we'll get back to that. Trends change, etc. So there's an objectivity and subjectivity elements. And I think being able to dissociate the two and understand what is a sort of like temporary truth, but what is like a universal truth, is important when you're looking at knowledge and you're looking at learning things about coffee specifically, because some things do remain true over time, and some things are trends or will turn out to be untrue in the future.
So in your mind, is truth something that comes from experts, or are experts the ones that are meant to dish out the truth? What's the relationship between truth or / knowledge and who's presenting it?
So it's interesting to sort of like dissect it and sort of like lay it down, so to have a look at it. But truth is usually comes from experts. Experts usually establish a certain number of truths, and usually the process of it is they've done enough research and they have enough exposure and experience to establish that truth. And it's supposed to be done in a sort of scientific way. So as in a way that follows a specific methodology, in a way that you're sort of like pursuing this application of a specific understanding in order to understand a specific phenomenon, and you're basing this on evidence. So then out of that sort of like scientific process, you're establishing a certain number of truths. The thing is, well, science evolves and science can be wrong, and scientists were wrong in the past and they will be wrong in the future, and they're wrong today. Like, it's something that's supposed to be constantly evolving as well, which means that something that is proven to be true, so an evidence that is being proven over a certain series of tests and experiments, might be proven to be wrong tomorrow, or we might realize that it's way more complex than we thought. There's a lot more intricacies to it than we believed in the first place. So experts, to go back to your question, experts do establish this sort of do establish truths and trends in the industry.
But they may not necessarily be right all the time.
No, they may not be right. And I think that's something that as we spoke about this theme, I was trying to reflect on what sparked this in me to sort of like question this not like the knowledge and have this like constant critical thinking about knowledge in general. I couldn't quite pinpoint a specific event, but something that I've always said in trainings that I conduct on a daily basis, and I've been doing for years now, is there are things that I will be teaching in a specific environment that are probably true today, or probably true here for a specific circle, but it might not be true tomorrow. And I've always encouraged people to be critical about that and to sort of take everything with a bit of distance and do some experiments themselves and decide if this is true as well, rather than just take my word for granted. And I think this is an important, it's something really important that doesn't just apply to coffee, but it applies to all sorts of expertise in very different areas.
And, I find it interesting the way that people in our industry decide to choose who an expert is based on whether they've won barista competitions or whether they own businesses, whether they're Instagram famous or whatever. I'm constantly fascinated by by how people in our industry decide to label somebody an expert. And you and I have had these conversations before of where we enter these dangerous territories whereby these little cults form in the industry, and then the cult leader is all of a sudden dishing out what people think is true, when in actual fact, when people look behind that so-called truth, it's a marketing tool to get some product sold. And
it doesn't just happen in coffee. I think if you look at other industries, France is one of the biggest smoking countries in the world, and definitely the biggest. I think in Europe, people smoke all the time. There's a huge tradition of smoking. And 50, 60 years ago, it was advised by doctors to be smoking. It was a good thing for your health to be smoking.
Wow.
Like, people thought it was actually healthy because there was science, there was scientific evidence made by the cigarette lobbies, tobacco lobbies, to show that it was true. In the 70s, we found that global warming was actually a thing, and there's been some heavy lobbying to showcase that there's no correlation between fossil fuel and global warming in general. So scientists get wrong, and sometimes for marketing purposes, sometimes because it's driven by profits. So it can be intentionally, it can be unintentionally. But I think the issue is it's not so much about people are trying to manipulate others. I mean, that's definitely an issue, but what can you do about that? But the thing that we can do is be critical about the 100%. Information that we're being fed, and having this. You don't want to become French and become cynical and constantly skeptical. But I think having that little voice in the back of your head asking you, they're telling you, is this true? Where is the evidence of that? Is this evidence reliable? Just because someone says that they're a scientist and that there's science backing that evidence, like going a little bit further into that, I think is really important. It's doing your due diligence, but it takes time, it takes energy. There's so much information. We're exposed to so much information throughout our days through social media, news, etc. That it's super difficult to dissect all of that. But I think it's important, and it's up to whoever is being exposed to this information to do their due diligence and double check some of these things.
Question the knowledge. Like, just because somebody says,
absolutely,
you should use this tool because it makes your coffee taste better. Sometimes we
Yeah,
want to believe
because
the
of
things.
X, Y, Z evidence. Yeah, absolutely. But I think a lot of the time people are looking for shortcuts, and this is something, again, it's true in many different things in life. So if someone came up with a product that could substantially increase the way, like improve the way your coffee is tasting, of course you would want to have access to that. It's much easier to do it this way rather than learning all the intricacies about brewing and looking at different variables and building years of sort of like intuition. So if you can have shortcuts, people will try to take shortcuts. But yeah,
tis the times we live in, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure it's always been like that. I feel like it's sort of like a recurrent circle, and I'm sure it's just the nature of human beings, like being able to take shortcuts and go to what's easier to digest in terms of information.
Yeah. So given that, what we're going to talk about next in the next episode, folks, is this idea that knowledge can be objective or subjective or both at the same time based on your perspective of that part of knowledge. So join us in the next episode when we explore deeper coffee knowledge. We'll see you then. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, friends. There are 2 ways you can support this podcast. Firstly, become a paid member of our YouTube channel. Secondly, you can join our Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video before you leave, and check the show notes for more information. Now, this is what you should check out next.